I was 42 when it landed. At a gathering, someone mentioned what one of them had become, a person I'd started out alongside, 30 years back, same age, same starting line. And the room nodded the way rooms do about someone who's arrived, settled, finished almost. Of course he'd become that. I stood there and did the quiet arithmetic. We'd started in the same place. He was sure of his shape now, and I still felt like a rough draft. Maybe you know this too. Maybe you've stood in your own version of that room. Hearing about someone who started where you started and seemed to get there while you were still forming, still working out what you even were. I'm Daniel, and I'll tell you the thing it took me most of my life to believe. You weren't behind. I don't say that to comfort you. I say it because I've come to think behind was the wrong word for what was happening. And the day I found the right one, the whole thing stopped feeling like failure. But that only moves the real question back a step. Because if you weren't behind, then what were all those slow years actually doing? That's the part I want to sit with tonight. Here's the first thing, and it took me longest to see. Behind only means something if everyone is running the same race on the same clock toward the same line. That's what the word assumes. That somewhere there's a schedule we were all handed and some people are keeping to it, and some of us fell off the pace. But there is no schedule. There never was. I looked for it for 40 years, the instruction I was sure everyone else had gotten, and I'll tell you plainly that it does not exist. Nobody has it. The people who seem to be keeping to it are just people whose particular clock happened to run fast. I keep a bit of a garden, and there's something out there that taught me this better than any amount of thinking did. You put marigolds in the ground in spring, and by June they're blazing. Full, loud, complete. Everything they are ever going to be, they are by midsummer. And right beside them, you can plant something that does, as far as your eye can tell, nothing. First year, nothing. A bare stick. You'd swear it had died. If the only clock you knew was the marigolds, you'd look at that stick and call it behind. But it isn't a slow marigold. It's a different plant entirely. It's on a longer clock, and it was never going to keep the marigold schedule because it was never a marigold. Now here's what that costs while it's happening, and I won't pretend it doesn't cost, because you don't get to know at the time which one you are. Nobody hands you a label that says longer clock. All you know is that the marigolds around you are blazing, and you are a bare stick in the ground, and everyone looking at you, everyone measuring by the only clock they know, reads that as failure, including you. I felt it hardest in my 30s. There was a dinner, I was 36, maybe 37, where someone I loved asked me, gently, with real worry in it, when I thought I'd finally settle into something. Find my footing. She didn't mean it as a cruelty, she meant it as care. That's what made it land the way it did. And I had no answer. I sat there with nothing to say, because by her clock, the only clock either of us knew to use, I was late. I should have found my shape by then. I couldn't tell her I was on a longer one. I didn't know it myself yet. I just knew I couldn't keep the pace, and I'd begun to believe that meant something was wrong with me at the root. That's the real loneliness of it. Not that you're slow and you don't yet know why, and neither does anyone who loves you. So the only story available to all of you is that you're failing. So then, What were those years? If they weren't failure, what were they? I want to be careful here because there's a comfortable lie sitting right next to the truth, and I don't want to hand you the lie. The lie is that the slow years were secretly productive, that every lost, going nowhere stretch was quietly building toward some payoff, like a plan you couldn't see. I don't believe that. Some of those years were just hard. Some were wasted. I'm not going to tell you your lost time was secretly a strategy, because it isn't honest, and you'd know it. Let me tell you about one of those years, so you don't think I'm speaking from above it. In my late 20s, I took a job everyone agreed was right for me. Steady. Sensible. The kind of thing that makes the people who love you stop worrying for a while. And I remember the exact afternoon I knew I couldn't stay in it. Nothing dramatic, no blow-up. I was standing at a window on an ordinary Wednesday, looking at a parking lot, and I felt something in me quietly refuse. Not rebel. Refuse. The way a hand won't close around a thing that's the wrong shape. I left that job a few months later. Couldn't explain it to anyone, including myself. It looked, from the outside, exactly like a man who couldn't commit, who threw away a good thing for no reason he could name. And for a long time, that's how I told the story too. As a flaw, as the evidence file on everything wrong with me. I don't tell it that way anymore. But I want to be clear. I didn't leave that job because some wise inner voice was steering me toward a grand plan. I left because I couldn't do otherwise, and it cost me years of looking like the one who wandered. Both of those are true. The refusal was real, and the wandering was real, and neither one came with a map. Here's what I think is actually true, underneath all of it. The marigold arrives early because a marigold is a simple, finished thing. It doesn't need long because there isn't much to become. And some of the people who seemed so settled at 30 arrived early because they stopped early. They found a shape that fit and they closed around it, and it held. Good for them. That's a real way to live, and I don't say it with any sneer in it. But some things take the first 50 years just to become the thing the last ones need them to be. And I finally understood why the year I actually watched one of those slow plants come back. Because here's what the bare stick is doing, that whole first year, while it looks dead. It isn't resting, it's going down. Everything it has, it's putting into root. Into the part nobody praises and nobody can see because it's underground where there's nothing to show anyone. The marigold spends its whole self on the bloom, up top, where it counts, this season. The slow plant spends its first years on the part that has to survive a winter the marigold will never have to face. That's the trade. The marigold is finished and lovely and gone by the first frost. The slow one looks like nothing for years, and then it holds, through cold that ends everything quicker than it, precisely because it spent all that unseen time building the part that holds. You weren't failing to arrive, you were doing the slower thing. You were putting it into root, where nothing showed, in a season that only rewards the bloom. There's one more thing, and it's the part almost nobody warns you about. It's what it feels like to find out late, because there's a particular moment, it came for me somewhere in my 50s, when the whole thing finally turns over and you understand what you were. And I'll be honest with you about the shape of that moment, because it isn't clean. Half of it is relief, enormous, quiet relief. The verdict you'd been carrying since your 30s, that something was wrong with you at the root turns out to have been a category error. You put it down. That's real, and it's a mercy. But the other half is a kind of grief, and it doesn't get talked about, because right behind the relief comes the thought, nobody could have told me. There was no one in all those years who could have leaned over and said, "You're on a longer clock, hold on." The roots don't show, not to the people who loved me, and not to me. So I spent decades believing the worst thing about myself, and there was no shortcut through that believing. The relief and the anger arrive in the same hour. You're grateful to finally know, and you're grieved at how long the not knowing cost you. I sat with both of those for a while. I still do, some evenings. I don't think you get the one without the other. So here's the turn, and it's a quiet one. You were never behind. You were perennial. The word behind needed a race you were never actually in. You were holding a perennial up against a marigold's calendar and calling the difference a failing. And I'll be honest about what that does and doesn't fix. It does not give you back the years you spent believing you were broken. It doesn't undo the dinners where you had no answer, or the rooms where you stood feeling like a rough draft. That happened. And it was, in its own way, a kind of hell. The not knowing was the worst of it, and no one could have talked you out of it at the time, because the roots don't show. I couldn't see mine either. What it changes is what the slowness means, looking back. It wasn't the world outrunning you. It was you, on your own clock, becoming something that takes longer to become. That's not a consolation, it's just the truer account. I'll leave you with this. The ones who arrived early arrived at a finished thing. You are not a finished thing, you're a slower one. And slower is not the same as later, and later is not the same as behind. You weren't running late. You were never on that clock. Tell me in the comments, did you spend years feeling behind the people you started out with? I'd like to know. And if you want to sit with me again, subscribe. I'll be here. I'm Daniel. I'll see you in the late hours.